Twilight Princess by far had one of the most memorable dungeons in the whole Zelda series. These dungeons contain some really clever puzzle solving, along with intricate atmospheres, unique items, and some top-of-the-line boss battles. For this list, boss battles will be included as a factor as the dungeon's ranks, but this will not be the case for Hyrule Castle, as I always like to keep the game's finale separate from the elements of the dungeon. Now that everything's cleared up, here are my top 9 Twilight Princess dungeons. At number 9 is the Temple of Time. Although I praise this game for its dungeons, this is the only dungeon in the game that I never really look forward to. The whole dungeon itself is way too linear, filled with mostly tedious puzzles. And worse yet, after you reach a halfway point, you have to backtrack throughout the whole dungeon just to get back to the first room. Sure, it was fun to control all those statues with the domain rod, but I still felt so held back from all the backtracking while doing so. When it comes to the boss and mini-boss, the boss was really nothing too special, but the mini-boss was actually a very pleasant surprise, as the fight is one of my favorite moments in the whole game. Although, the bad severely outweighs the good, so that's why it is ranked last on my list. At number 8 is the Forest Temple. This dungeon wasn't really that bad for an opening dungeon. I love trying to find all the monkeys to progress, and that was a cool concept. On top of that, the Gale Boomerang saw many clever uses in this dungeon, as it was used to sweep up bombs, put out fires, and so much more. The two biggest downfalls of this dungeon were the boss and the aesthetic. The boss was just very bland and simple, and the look of the dungeon just got very bland very quickly. The dungeon doesn't rank this low because it was bad, as I thought it was actually pretty fun. There are just so many better dungeons on this list. At number 7 is the Palace of Twilight. I know I've said that I hated linear dungeons, which I do, but this one consisted of more fun and non-repetitive moments in the Temple of Time. First off, the aesthetic. The twilight that rings from the skies is by far one of the coolest elements about the game, and having a whole temple that revolves around that is awesome. On top of that, I love the segments in the dungeon where I was being chased by Zan's hand, and I had to quickly evade it to progress throughout the dungeon. When it comes to the boss fight, man, this part delivered. Overall, it was a unique dungeon with good execution. Number 6 is City in the Sky. Having the double claw shots to traverse a giant, floating dungeon made the scale of this dungeon just seem so grand. I love clinging onto walls, p-hats, and any other graded surface to traverse my way through the place. This dungeon was definitely weighted down by some of the outer segments, more specifically, the waiting. There were so many times where Link was waiting in this dungeon, whether it was waiting for a platform to spin in his direction, or waiting a long time for a p-hat to finally take Link to his destination. These slow-paced sections only happened a few times, so it's not like it killed my feelings about this dungeon completely. I love this dungeon a lot, especially the final boss fight. Number 5 is Goron Mines. This is a great example of a solid dungeon. There are fun puzzles spread throughout, along with interesting corridors to traverse. I love the mix of both indoor and outdoor segments, as they both mesh really well with each other. Sure, the boss and mini-boss weren't the best, but they definitely didn't make me hate the dungeon. Although the bow and arrow was a really great item for the dungeon, the iron boots were a bit controversial. It was fun to cling onto the giant metal lifts in the outdoor segment, but my only big problem with the dungeon was that using the boots to climb on the walls felt very slow and tedious. Other than that, it was a really great dungeon. Number 4 is Hyrule Castle. Since the boss battle in this dungeon is actually the finale, I cannot rank it as part of the dungeon itself. However, this formula-breaking dungeon was a lot of fun. The atmosphere of this dungeon was really key, as the ambient sounds of the outer segment and the ghostly melody of the indoor segment meshed perfectly with the feel of the dungeon. Throughout finding ghostly soldiers, riding boars to the courtyard, and defeating King Bulbin for the last time, and killing waves of powerful enemies, this dungeon was very memorable. Number 3 on this list is Snowpeak Ruins. Just like Hyrule Castle, this was a dungeon made out of a very believable structure. Instead of having some random forest maze or floating city, this is simply a giant snowy mansion that was taken over by monsters. I'm not saying I prefer this over the main types of dungeons, I'm just saying that it's nice to see a different change of style. I loved having to make my way through this dungeon to find all the different ingredients. Also, finding cannonballs to fire off cannons that allowed you to unlock different areas of the dungeon was a really fun concept, and it was evolved by the use of the ball and the chain. Talking about the ball and chain, the mini-boss fight to acquire it was really great, just like the main dungeon boss itself. The dungeon is by far one of my favorites in the whole series, and that's saying a lot considering it's only at number 3. At number 2 is Lakebed Temple. This dungeon feels very underrated, but honestly, I loved it. Using the giant staircase to manipulate the flow of water was such a great idea for dungeon progression, and it forced you to think of what the outcome of your actions would cause instead of just mindless trial and error. This dungeon had lots of little cool moments that stuck out, such as the giant water slides and some fun ways to use the claw shots. Although the boss and mini-boss fights were nothing too amazing, the dungeon itself was still incredible. Number 1 is, you guessed it, Arbiters Grounds. The ancient Egyptian architecture mixed with the creepy, ghostly vibe really made this dungeon pop. Dealing with frightening mummies, terrifying ghosts, booby traps, and all sorts of puzzles around enhanced the memorability significantly. The spinner was a great way to evolve the dungeon, as it was used in lots of platformer segments that required lots of thought of when to travel from rail to rail. I love the fear factor that the mini-boss in this dungeon had, but by far the standout feature of the dungeon was the final boss, Stallard. He was a great way to sum up by far the best dungeon in the game, and even one of the best in the whole Zelda series. Thank you so much for watching my video. If you have any suggestions for future videos, or even any feedback on this one, feel free to comment. Please subscribe and turn on notifications to see my future content, and I'll see you in the next video.